right? Or I prefer to think of tafsir as the science of answering questions about the Quran pertaining to its meaning, right? So you can ask lots of other questions about the Quran and study the Quran from numerous angles, and that's all in ulum al-Quran.
Right.
But when you ask about the meaning of the Quran, this is what we call tafsir. This comes in 2 volumes, gorgeous cover. You know, they say don't judge a book by its cover, but try stop me. Because I saw the title and I thought, Nahu, tick, kutub, tick, tafsir, double tick, right?
This is fascinating.
Oh, it's mind-blowing.
It's mind. I've just read a couple of pages. I was like,
you're gonna have to write down some titles to like.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We left off you talking about ulum al-Quran, and we wanted to transition over to ulum al-Tafsir. You have quite a collection here of it. I saw some titles that caught my eye, but I want you to get started with some things that you think are worthy of mention first to get us started on the subject.
So, of course, tafsir is itself the science of explaining the Quran.
Right.
Right? Or I prefer to think of tafsir as the science of answering questions about the Quran pertaining to its meaning. Right? So you can ask lots of other questions about the Quran and study the Quran from numerous angles, and that's all in ulum al-Quran.
Right.
But when you ask about the meaning of the Quran, this is what we call tafsir.
Right.
And then all the things that we need in order to do tafsir successfully, we can call the usul of tafsir, or the things that underpin the fundamentals or the principles of tafsir. And then in English, tafsir, I use the word exegesis. That's the kind of the most common way of talking about it.
Right.
And then the usul of tafsir can be called hermeneutics. So hermeneutics is a very fancy word, and people have different points of view about it.
Right.
But basically, hermeneutics in terms of the Western development of the term emerged from the prerogative to interpret the Bible.
Right.
How do we understand the Bible? But then it became, how do we understand texts in general? What is understanding of meaning? How does the brain work? And it extends in different directions. For Muslims, when we talk about usul al-tafsir, we are still completely meaning in interpreting the Quran.
Right.
But of course, there's so much in that can be broadened to, like, how do you understand any text? How do you understand any language and communication? So it is helpful to have this broader perspective that the Quran is a communication. It is words. It is speech. It is particular and special in many ways.
Right.
But there are things that are particular about its interpretation, and there are other things that just are common sense.
That are just common to all language.
So, for example, things should be understood in context. Is this a specific rule for the Quran, or is it in general?
Right.
And why is it a rule for the Quran? Well, because it is a commonsensical thing about all understanding, right? Any statement which is taken out of context is in danger of being misunderstood by thinking about what was said before and perhaps what was said after.
Right.
You have a much, much higher chance of understanding correctly what was intended by thinking about where it was said, when, to whom, in what mood, what tone and body language.
Right.
That would all affect,
and what speech is it a part of?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So usul al-tafsir anyway is, of course, a science which with many dimensions to it, which we'll come to. But one of the aspects of that is actually looking at what mufassirin did and how they operated. So for the most part, all these different mufassirs throughout time, they did what they did, and then people can look at it and say, by studying their practice, we can
extract the principles they were applying
and see which of these are successful and which of them are questionable, and so on. So in terms of like this genre of gathering what has been done, this is perhaps the most famous book. It comes, typically in 3 volumes. I've got 3 volume 1, التفسير والمفسرون of Dr. Muhammad Hussein al-Dhahhabi, who was the Wazir al-Awqaf in Egypt.
So it's a contemporary work.
Well, it's a 20th century work, which by now is now out of date. I mean, but at his time was well ahead of the curve, because one of the things he did, rahimahullah, is he talked a lot about things that weren't yet published. So he talked about them even though they're in manuscript form. He gave an idea about what's in them. And he did some attempt to categorize things, to give some sense of the history and the progression of tafsir. And those ideas became very influential. But later on, perhaps, we start to say, all right, we need sort of better approaches than what he attempted in his book. So among the better approaches, I mean, I've got this very charming kind of, there's a few books inside this one. And one of them is by al-Fadl ibn Ashur, who is the son of the famous mufassir Tahir ibn Ashur. So he's got a book called التفسير ورجاله. And I've got it somewhere. So my eyes get caught by some things. So التفسير ورجاله is actually...
For those of you who don't know, the process of interpreting and explaining the meanings of the Quran and the people behind it.
Yeah. Or exegetes and its men. If it's going to be
exegetes and its men, yeah.
If we're going to get literal about it. So his book is perhaps more thoughtful, although it's much shorter because it's not that whole work. Then you've got all sorts of different books of مناهج المفسرين. I pulled this out because
methodologies.
That's written by my teacher, Dr. الفتاح العواري, who was until recently the head of كلية أصول الدين in al-Azhar. And then sometimes you get in a specific region. So this is التفسير المفسرون بالمغرب الأقصى, so the far west of the Islamic world. And sometimes
the interpretations of the Quran and the methodologies of the interpreters specifically belonging to the far west.
Yeah. So
what is that? Why is
so al-Maghrib al-Aqsa would include Spain,
right?
So this kind of gives you a thematic approach, because now you're going to see what was happening in Morocco and Spain, and then what are some of the specific trends that have emerged there, and the connections between those tafsirs and those mufassirun.
Interesting.
So it can be useful to take less than a universal approach sometimes.
Yeah.
Then you've got this one, which is by the late Fadl Hassan Abbas, scholar in Jordan. Yeah, he passed away just a few years ago. I'm sure if anyone wants, yeah, his photograph is on this collection here. But he is looking particularly at modern tafsirs. So there are actually a few more works I've got here about modern tafsirs and some assessment of, from Muhammad Abduh onwards, what are some of the trends in the 20th century tafsir in particular. So it's useful to see, and he's a very insightful scholar, Fadl Hassan Abbas. This is in 3 volumes. He gives you some insights about these tafsirs and what's underpinning them. And I think the last one that I would specifically highlight in مناهج المفسرين is an unusual one.
النحو وكتب التفسير.
النحو وكتب التفسير. So I'm very proud of this one, because it's one of the books that I picked up just because I saw the title and I thought, نحو, tick, كتب, tick, tafsir, double tick, right? But I thought, what is this? I've never heard of this book.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't, my students know, your students would know, Nahu, or people that have background, Nahu is grammar. Grammar in the books of tafsir.
Yeah,
syntax and things like that.
This comes in 2 volumes, gorgeous cover. They say don't judge a book by its cover, but try stop me. It's gorgeous cover, and it comes, I just thought the topic is so enticing. And it turned out to be a really formative book for me, because it gave a sense of, that sometimes when people present the history of tafsir, they want to really remove the factor of language from the story.
Right.
So the story that's sometimes painted is, people they heard the meanings from the Prophet ﷺ, and then they just transmitted those meanings. So in the beginning, what happened was tafsir bil-ma'thur. And later on, people came and they found, okay, there's something more to be said. So they started using their opinion. And using their opinion means using language. So tafsir bil-lugha means tafsir bil-ra'i. Tafsir bil-ra'i, interpreting according to opinion, or educated opinion, as I like to call it.
Yeah.
Sometimes goes right, sometimes goes wrong. So so again, going back to Dr. الذهبي.
This is fascinating.
Oh, it's mind-blowing.
I've just read a couple of pages. I was like,
you're going to have to write down some titles to buy.
Yeah.
So Tafsir al-Mufassirun, he talks about Tafsir bil-Ra'i as being either mahmud or madhmoom. It's either like praiseworthy or blameworthy. And the criterion is, it's praiseworthy if you belong to my group, and it's blameworthy if you belong to the other group. Right? So because he's Azhari, Ash'ari, so he exemplifies the praiseworthy type as Tafsir of al-Razi,
Right.
up there.
Yeah.
And the blameworthy Tafsir of al-Zamakhshari. Now,
Got
of
it.
course, al-Razi is based on Zamakhshari and among others. So it's hard to, make these very neat lines. Between, the praiseworthy and blameworthy. But anyway, that's why I say his theories, they had a lot of influence, but they need to be revised. And this book, I think, does a lot of that.
It looks like a very academically thorough work.
So underrated. But what I noticed that Professor Walid Saleh of Toronto, who's one of the leaders of, tafsir studies within the Western academic context, he actually praised this book. Not based on my recommendation, but also independently of my being amazed by it. So I took that as, confirmation that I was onto something when I looked at this.
Pencil notes.
Pencil notes, yeah. So I asked myself questions. I have a lot of questions in this book because it made me think a lot.
Yeah.
But so we're going to talk about some of the early works of Ma'ani al-Quran and I'rab al-Quran and so on. A lot of these predate the genre of tafsir as it emerged later on.
Isn't that fascinating? And we're going to dig into that because that's a separate discussion.
Yeah.
And I don't want to undermine the I'rab section by having that juicy discussion.
But it just shows you that is definitely part of the story. The linguistic study of the Quran has been there since the earliest
times. Yeah, that's right.
So Usul al-Tafsir, lots of different things going on here. I've got things about Asbab al-Nuzul and order. This is a whole critique, a big chunky critique of the idea of ordering the tafsir according to
the sabab,
the time of revelation. So putting it in chronological order.
Right. It's a criticism of that approach.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, 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 really bad according to this person to do that. So that's why he had a lot of pages to basically say.
I mean, I saw people that have worked on that sort of thing and try to do that for the entire Mus'haf. I just think that the evidence to do that is, if you aggregate it, it's flimsy at best.
So the famous one is Muhammad Izzat Darwaza. He's got a Tafsir al-Hadith, and he ordered it according to chronology.
Yeah.
But again, I think sometimes these things, if it exists alongside other things, and
it can have some benefit.
The idea is like, what would happen? What if we explored from this angle? Rather than saying, okay, this is the proper way to do tafsir. Same thing about translations, as we'll talk about translations as well.
Right.
Sometimes a person does a kind of strange methodology, but yeah, I'm glad someone tried that to see what happens. Yeah, just leave it at that.
Yeah.
مقدمة في أصول التفسير. So the field of أصول التفسير as such, there haven't been that many works that have that title or were conceived in that way. So one that kind of is Ibn Taymiyyah's work مقدمة في أصول التفسير. Although that is not the actual title he gave to it, that's what some editors gave it in the 20th century. He probably called it, this is a brand new edition done this year. He called it قاعدة عظيمة القدر شريفة في تبيين ما يعين على فهم القرآن وتفسيره ومعرفة معانيه.
That's the title?
Yeah.
It sounds like chapter 1.
Yeah, so that is probably what he intended to be the title. But he often has titles like that. That's a short one for him, actually. So this new edition is actually very interesting in...
Oh, it's got the manuscript in it.
Well, it's got some pictures of the manuscript. But this researcher, Sami Jadallah, he has uncovered that probably there's been a mistake in understanding which parts of this introduction were actually written by Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah. Because, okay, this is a translation. Typically, you find that there are 6 chapters in the Muqaddimah. But as it turns out, according to this researcher, chapters 5 and 6 shouldn't be in this work by Ibn Taymiyyah because these were actually written by Ibn Kathir. So Ibn Kathir is a student, of course, of Ibn Taymiyyah. In the first volume of his... Okay, I'm going to do this. Hold on. I moved things around a little bit. So, there we go. In the first volume of Ibn Tafsir's Kathir, Ibn Tafsir's Kathir, right? I'm sticking with that now. Right in the beginning of Ibn Tafsir's Kathir, we have got what has typically been thought of as the reproduction of chapters 5 and 6
of Ibn
from
Taymiyyah.
here. But as he's now arguing, I think quite well, it's actually kind of the other way around. What happened is that people mistakenly tacked this introduction by Ibn Kathir onto Ibn Taymiyyah's works. So it helps to keep up to date with research.
Yeah.
Right. So if you've just bought a book and think, well, I've done it, there's going to be other editions. There's going to be new things that update the knowledge.
New things that get unearthed. What is this? قصة التأويل في القرآن الكريم.
قضية التأويل. This is.
قضية, sorry.
So yeah, this is the issue of ta'wil. So one of the words that's used for hermeneutics actually is ta'wil. So some of these books, like this one.
There's a lot of ta'wil titles, yeah.
Yeah, these are actually, so these in particular are coming from one of the important centers for Quranic studies. This is in Morocco. It's part of روضة المحمدية للعلماء, and they have مركز الدراسات القرآنية, Quranic Studies Center. They publish a number of important works, and they have conferences around hermeneutics, and they're trying to expand the subject a little bit, as I said, beyond just the immediacy of how do we interpret the Quran, but the broader sense of interpretation, that what we can learn from how we study the Quran as well. That's how I would roughly characterize what they're doing, but this is one that I'll admit I haven't read. مفهوم التأويل في القرآن الكريم دراسة مصطلحية. A lot of the, this is a female scholar, Dr. Farida Zumarrad, or Zumurrud, I'm not sure how to pronounce her name, I'm afraid. But this is a lot of what they are doing in this Moroccan center, which is headed by a senior scholar called Shahid al-Bushikhi. They are looking at particular subjects or terms used in the Quran and studying how that term, it's a kind of tafsir mawdu'i, a kind of thematic tafsir, which is something that I've got another section on.
Right.
But also they have got this work here about tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran.
Interesting.
My story with this is that I wanted to get it before I did my PhD thesis, because my thesis was about tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran.
Right.
I did have this book, which is a Saudi one, which is subtitled Ta'silun wa Taqweem. Let's say, establishing the principles and evaluating works in tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran. But for a large part, this book talks about, what goes wrong in this field, and especially, when the other people do it, when the non-orthodox people, according to us, do that type of tafsir, how does it go wrong? So his PhD thesis was actually entitled أسباب الخطأ في تفسير القرآن بالقرآن.
Oh.
And then he sort of softened it for the title. And this one is probably closer to my spirit and purpose. But I only got it after finishing, because it was just because the Quranic Studies Center in Morocco doesn't answer their emails. I tried, but no one could tell me how to get it and how, where is it stocked, or if I could purchase it from them, or if they could send it. But eventually someone found it for me and sent it my way. Allah reward them.
So it's pretty awesome.
So yeah, it's pretty good. But inshallah, I'm planning to add to this section my own book. So based on my PhD thesis, there will be a book in English called Explaining the Quran Through the Quran.
Right.
That's coming out with Edinburgh University Press, inshallah. And I'm hoping that it will get translated into Arabic and published, maybe by one of these centers that we're cooperating with and developing a relationship with. So yeah, plenty of individual sections. I mean, a few things that are important, I would say. This is a book by a scholar who's based in London now, Yasir al-Matrafi. It's called Al-Aqaidiyya wa Tafsir Nas al-Qur'ani. So it kind of looks at how how the various schools of belief affect how the Quran is interpreted. So, but he does that in a quite a novel and critical way, rather than just sort of assuming, as some of these books do, that, well, obviously our group is the right one, so let's just...
He's just stepping back and looking at it.
Well, yeah, he treats it in an academic way. so that one can understand how all kind of faith commitments have some effect on how you read. And that's a key thing in hermeneutics in general. They have something which they call the hermeneutic circle, which is that you are engaging with the text and you're moving between your world and the world of the text.
Right.
You bring certain things to the text. It doesn't mean that it's impossible to be somewhat objective. It just means that you cannot completely deny your subjectivity and your position
Absolutely.
as a reader of the text.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, yeah, what else catches your eye over here? I mean,
actually, one did القراءة المعاصرة للقرآن في الميزان.
covers. Yeah, let's see the cover. Right. So I've got a small section here which is like critiques of modernist interpretations. We've got التيار العلماني الحديث.
Right.
Next
Right. I saw that too. Yeah.
But this one is better because, right, this is talking about Sheikh, sorry, I don't really call him Sheikh, but Dr. Muhammad Shahrur
Okay.
is the author of Al-Kitab wal-Quran, قراءة معاصرة. So he has got this book which, he's got followers who are interested in his sort of re-interpretations of the Quran. He's not a classically trained scholar. He comes with controversial ideas in many of his books, but he's very prolific, and he appears on TV, stations.
I think I may have seen some of his videos.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, you must have. Yeah. So one of his most famous books, this one, Al-Kitab wal-Quran, because he distinguishes between what is meant by the Kitab and what is meant by the Quran. I can't remember the precise details of it. I also don't want to elaborate too much. Yeah. But the point is that this book is, putting it fil mizan. That is to say, in the scales. So normally what you'd do is you'd put the book and you'd carefully analyze and assess, ما له وما عليه.
Right.
So the pros and cons of the book, where it's written. So this one, but and the cover designer felt that this is not strong enough really. I'm going to put the mizan through the book. Right? So it's taken the scale and then it's got this sharp arrow and it's cracked into through the cover.
It's الميزان
في القراءة المعاصرة للقرآن. So
it's not.
I think I've read parts of this.
Kind of became obvious what he's trying to get at.
So you know what? Sometimes books are a bit extra, but you can still get something from it. Like you can see what's the point of the point.
Besides the rant, he has an academic criticism of that approach.
I think the author, to be honest, is not also a specialist scholar. If I remember correctly, he's a lawyer or something. So it's like
two guys going at it,
fighting the blind or something. But in any case, there's a lot of books that critique Shahrur.
المعنى القرآني بين التفسير والتأويل.
Pull it out. Yeah. I haven't read this one yet, but this is among the things that are exploring Ta'wil in general here as hermeneutics, and then tafsir as the established kind of the science that has its long history in the Islamic context. And this one is also a Moroccan author, Qutb al-Raisuni, and this was an award-winning book in Morocco. And in it, he also criticizes some Western writers. Amina Wadood is one of them. Probably it's got others like Shahrur and whatnot. Yeah, Muhammad Shahrur. So sometimes what happens is you get this kind of reactive approach. Nasr Hamid Abu Zaid is mentioned as well.
Interesting.
So, what interests me, and so I've written one paper about this. Maybe I'll go and fetch that. There's a book by Abdul Sabur Shaheen. Yeah, I think it's here. So Abdul Sabur Shaheen wrote a book called Abi Adam. And actually the idea that he's got here, roughly speaking, is that a type of evolutionary theory can be compatible with the Quran.
Okay.
And in that, he actually followed quite closely what Shahrur wrote in his book, but he denies that he took it from Shahrur. In fact, Abdul Sabur Shaheen was a far more conservative scholar, and he actually had televised debates with Shahrur. So it's kind of funny that he ended up repeating some of his ideas. But in this book, you know, he makes his case, and I've talked about the case that he made. I've also talked about the responses that he received. For example, this one by an Azhari scholar, Abi Adam, and then he kind of gives a title which responds back to Shaheen. But what I was trying to get at in my paper, which is called the Shaheen Affair and the Evolution of Usul al-Tafsir, pun intended as usual, is that that Usul al-Tafsir sometimes are being written in this reactionary sort of mode. So, oh, you have interpreted the Quran wrong. And then the next question should be, okay, so how do you establish that the wrong principles are being followed? So what are the actual principles?
Right.
So you need to go from the reactive, negative side towards something positive and constructive.
What made it wrong, and what was the right approach?
And what's the right approach? So that's where sometimes a lot of usul in our tradition have emerged from
just reactions.
Yeah, so some kind of conflict scenario where then it was necessary to say, oh, those people have got the wrong aqidah. Right, what we need to now do is to systematize and show what is the correct aqidah. So the same thing can happen in tafsir. The field of usul al-tafsir remains in much need of work and systematization and consolidation and expansion, and to incorporate new things as well. And so doing, there's going to be some aspects of debate, and sometimes it's helpful to show this example of where it's gone wrong shows us the urgency of explaining what's right, and also gives us some agenda points for what we have to defend.
Interesting, very interesting. This has been fascinating. Okay, so now we are 2 sections in. What's going to be the next topic of our discussion for next episode?
Well, we're going to roughly proceed up through the library.
Yeah.
So
we just covered the bottom floor.
We covered the bottom floor. One thing to finish on that is that in terms of this development of Usul al-Tafsir, one of the projects that is working on that, as well as the Moroccan one, is the one in Tafsir Center in Riyadh. So these are 2 books that they've got in their Usul al-Tafsir unit that they've set up. One of them is Usul al-Tafsir fil Mu'allafat. So what they did is they studied the situation. They looked at all the books, not necessarily these ones, but the ones that have got the title Usul al-Tafsir.
Right.
And they said, like, what's going on in those books, and what do they cover, and what is the overlap?
So they're trying to get an aggregate collection of what's been covered,
so that they can see like what comes next. And Usul al-Tafsir fi Ara al-Mutakhassisin. Here they did this poll of professors of Quranic studies from across the Arab and Muslim world. And they
interesting.
Got, like, what do you think is important? What do you think is missing? And so I really like their systematic approach to these things. They don't just jump in. They rinse the subject first before proceeding. So, but it shows you, and this is one thing that I used in my thesis, that experts in the subject themselves agree that there's much to do in the field of Usul.
Right.
That was an important thing. So inshallah, we get through Quranic language, then we've got the field of tafsir itself, we've got subject matters in the Quran, and then we've got more in the other sections of the library.
Yeah, okay. All right. Inshallah, see you next episode. Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Hope you guys are getting something beneficial out of this. I certainly am. Thank you.
How would you like to explore the heart of the Quran, Surah Yasin, guided by an important mufassir of the 20th century, Muhammad al-Tahir ibn Ashur? We've put on a special course at the Ibn Ashur Center, going through Surah Yasin with a new translation and a new commentary based on the important insights of this great exegete. Head on over to ibnashur.com/academy to find out more. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.